Thank you for the invitation. I would like to thank really Isabella for organizing this event and for bringing here really pioneers and scholars in the field of embodiment and architecture, and also to try to link neuroscience with architecture, which is a difficult job, and Isabella is doing fantastic work on this, thanks also to the collaboration with Olaf's lab. And so my contribution here is to try to put some more information from neuroscience on how our brain represents the body, and how our brain represents in particular our body in space. And if you think of space perception, the classic view that people think about space is this classic map, right? That now we have everybody on our smartphone. But really the idea that space is a map, is an abstract map. And actually, there is such an abstract map, or such abstract maps of space in the brain. There are parts of the brain which really computes space, if you want, in abstract point of view. Those are the place cells or the grid cells. And actually, the people who discovered them won the Nobel Prize for this. And this is a classic representation of space from an external perspective, an allocentric perspective. And if you want, a matching representation in architecture is this kind of plan. This is the Church of Santo Spirito in Firenze by Brunelleschi, and this is the plan of this church. But the problem here is that we do not perceive space in this way. We perceive space in this way, right? We are within the environment. We really feel the environment. This is the same church by Brunelleschi, but being in the observer point of view. So what we are interested in is understanding what is the difference between this representation of space and this representation of space, and how our brain codes this representation of space that we call egocentric representation of space, differently from this allocentric map of space. And this kind of representation, the subjective experience that we have of space, has at least two main properties which I want to highlight here and which will be the focus of my talk. First of all, it's an egocentric representation, that is perceived from the point of view of a subject, of the individual, which perceives the world outside. And this representation is normally centered to our physical body. We are there with our body. And the second point is that this representation, although I'm showing pictures here, it's a multisensory representation. Whenever you are in space, you don't only see it, you feel it. You feel it with all your senses. Auditory stimuli, somatosensory stimuli, proprioceptive information contributes to the sense of space. So space, it's a creation of the mind, of the brain. Space does not exist. Space is something that our brain builds time to time. And I think the key demonstration of this is that if you have a lesion of the particular areas of the brain, you lose representation of space. This is neuropsychological deficit called hemispatial neglect, or more simpler, neglect. And if you have a lesion normally to your right parietal cortex, normally patients after this kind of lesion do not perceive the contralateral, that is the left side of space. So they have a lesion in the right part of the brain, do not perceive the left side of space. Why neglect is particularly interesting and so fascinating for scientists and also for philosophers? Because it's not that these people do not see. It's not a visual deficit. It's not that these people do not hear the left side of space. It's that their brain do not represent this part of space. So if you ask these patients to, for instance, to draw a clock, this is how they normally do. So they put all the numbers on the right side because they do not represent the left side. If you ask those people to bisect this line at the middle point, they do like this. So that they try to ignore this left part of the line, and therefore they sign here. This actually is a drawing by Federico Fellini, who had neglect, and he added this artistic part on his neuropsychological test. If you ask these people to find these lines, very simple task on this paper, they only assign lines on the right side of space and they ignore completely the left sides. And what neglect tells us about how the brain represents space? So first of all, neglect is not a visual deficit. It was called visuospatial neglect a few years ago, but then people realized that it's not a visual deficit, so it's a multisensory deficit, and indeed you can have neglect, people have neglect for auditory stimuli, so they ignore sounds from the left side of space. They can even ignore half of their body. Of course, this is a representation of how could a patient with neglect feel his own body. It's a representation to try to show to us how can be the perception of a patient, but nobody of us can really understand what is that. It's as if this patient do not have half of their body. So neglect really tells tells about, us about how our brain represents space and how our brain creates the experience of space by integrating multisensory stimuli. There is another interesting thing about neglect is that patients can have neglect for separate sectors of space. That is, there are some patients who do not perceive the left side of the far space, but they will perceive the left side of the near space, and vice versa. There are patients who neglect the left side of the near space, but do perceive the left side of the far space. So there is a dissociation between what the near space, what is called peripersonal space, and the far space, what is called extrapersonal space. And really different brain lesions result in different way of perceiving space and different problems of perceiving either the near and the far space. So also neglect shows that space is not a unique representation. It's actually the aggregation of multiple representations. And what I want to talk to you about today is the space near the body, what we call the peripersonal space, or the space around the body. We have heard something about that from Olaf, from Isabella. And the idea is that really the peripersonal space is the space where our body directly interacts with the environment, where any interaction, physical interaction between the environment and the body occurs. And it is that, although we have the feeling that our body ends with our skin, our brain represents our body in the space near the body as the potential of interacting in the space. And I want to go a bit into the neurophysiology of how the brain represents peripersonal space. And the very first concept of peripersonal space came actually from Rizzolatti lab, the same lab who discovered mirror neurons. And in an area which is close from the mirror neuron areas, here in the portion of the premotor cortex and then later in the parietal cortex, they found that there are some special neurons in the monkey which respond to touch on a part of the animal body. So if you touch the animals, this neuron fires. And the very same neuron responds if there is a stimulus approaching the same body part. So for instance, there is this ball approaching the head of the animals and this neuron starts firing. And what this research discovered is that there are many neurons mapping each different body parts, and the response of these neurons to external stimulus depends on the distance of the stimulus from the mapped body part. And they do respond not only to visual stimulus, but also to auditory stimuli. So whenever there is an external event approaching our body, those neurons detect those events when this event is at a given distance from the body of the animal. And therefore, these neurons really build some maps, some spaces around specific body parts in a really multisensory way. So these are well done neurophysiological study, well known. We asked, is there a peripersonal space system also in humans, and can we measure this peripersonal space in humans? So in the last years, we developed this task to have a behavioral hallmark of what is the extent of peripersonal space in humans. And the task is very, very simple. So imagine that you are a subject, you come to our lab to do an experiment, and we want to map your trunk peripersonal space, for instance. So what we do, we put a tactile stimulator, a vibration of your trunk, and you have to respond as fast as you can to this vibration. And that's the only task you have to do. But then at the same time, here you have the auditory version of the task. We have these rows of loudspeakers which generate sounds that either approach or recede from you. And you are instructed to ignore sounds. So sounds is not task relevant for you. You have just to reply to touch. But then the trick is that we give this tactile sensation when the sound is a different distance from your body. And although you are instructed to ignore sounds, what we found is that as the sound approaches your body, you become faster and faster to respond to touch. Okay? And there is really a spatial position in space where this effect occurs, when an external stimulus facilitates the detection of tactile stimulation on your body. And this spatial location can be taken as a measure of the extent of this multisensory space around the body. So we started doing this experiment with auditory stimuli. Now, thanks to virtual reality and to a fancy virtual reality system we have in the lab called the Realis system, we are able also to do a visual version of the task, where instead of presenting sound, we present visual stimuli. And by combining these techniques and using this task, we actually show that there is a peripersonal space around human bodies, but actually there are different peripersonal spaces. So there is a hand peripersonal space, which is limited around the hand, and probably serves to mediate hand-object interaction. there is a phase peripersonal space, and there is a bigger one, which is a trunk peripersonal space, which also incorporates the other two. And we could really quantify the extent of peripersonal space, of different peripersonal space in humans. So we also did some neuroscience experiment to try to identify the areas where these peripersonal space neurons might be in humans. So those are the areas where peripersonal space neurons have been described in monkeys. What we did, we use TMS, which is a transcranial magnetic stimulation. It's a non-invasive way to interfere with activity of a given area. So you basically apply a magnetic stimulation on the scalp, and in this way you can interfere with the activity of neurons behind the place where you place the scalp. And in this way we interfere with activity of this part of the brain, which is the premotor cortex, and which the posterior parietal cortex, which are the key areas mapping the location of peripersonal space neurons in monkeys. And we show that if you interfere with these areas, you lose this multisensory facilitation for stimuli within the peripersonal space. So one very interesting properties of peripersonal space is that it is not fixed, it is plastic. So these are seminal work done by Atsushi Hiriki, Henry Mulgrave showed a paper by the same group, where they were measuring the extent of peripersonal space neurons in the parietal cortex of monkey. And what they show is that if at the beginning, at the baseline, the peripersonal space of the monkey was as this size, so when there was a stimulus here, the neurons fired, but when the stimulus was here, the neuron did not fire. Then they trained the monkey for 3 months to use a rake to reach food, which was displayed in a far position. And after that, they showed that the receptive fields of these neurons extended. So we did the same kind of experiments in humans with the idea that normally we interact with our body in a limited space around us, but we can use tools to expand our reaching space, to reach portion of space that normally are outreach. And we found that after 2 use, your peripersonal space extends. And we also tested expert tool users, like blind people using the cane, and we found that if you are an expert cane users, you have a different representation of space. You have an automatically extended representation of space whenever you hold your cane. But when you don't have your cane, your peripersonal space is normal, contracts to normal size. We also studied the representation of peripersonal space in amputees, and we show that if you lose a part of your body, your peripersonal space around it contracts, but then if you use a prosthesis, a functional prosthesis to expand again, to restore your body representation, then your peripersonal space enlarges again. We also show the opposite effect, that is, normally we can interact in a given sector of space, but if you are immobilized because you have an injury, or because you come to our lab and we immobilized you for 10 hours, after 10 hours of immobilization, the peripersonal space around the immobilized arm contracts. Okay? So it's really a plastic representation depending on the kind of experience, the kind of interaction you can have with the external world. We also did an experiment where we tested the peripersonal space around the computer mouse. And we found that whenever an expert computer user, like everybody now, holds a mouse in their hand, the peripersonal space expands to incorporate the computer screen. And this, you can imagine, can have important application, for instance, for telesurgery, when there is a surgeon operating here and the patient is in another location, or in the future where there will be, for sure, different ways of interacting with computer that will go well beyond the computer mouses. Then, all these experiments really show that peripersonal space is a space of interaction, or physical and object interaction, but of course you can think to interaction in a more complex way. And the most complex and most common interaction we have is with other people also, as our groups talk about. And I don't know if you are familiar with this concept from proxemics, the concept of personal space, that is the distance we keep from others. This is a very interesting book by Holtz back in the 60s, when he really described this idea of keeping distances from others, or the vital space we have to keep. And this concept has been used a lot in social psychology, also in architecture, because there is also a part of the book where he described kitchens in different cultures. And we asked, is there anything to do between this concept of personal space as defined by Holtz in the 60s and this concept of peripersonal space that we have in neuroscience? So we tested it. So we measured the peripersonal space with the task that I told you before, the one you have to respond to tactile stimuli when you have sounds. And we did it when our participant of the experiment was facing either another person, which was unknown to our participants, or a mannequin. So the mannequin is a body, occupies a given space as a body, but of course it's not animate, it's not a human. And what we found is that when there is another person in front of a participant, the peripersonal space of our participants contracts. It's a bit smaller as compared when there is a neutral object. As if people automatically divide the space between themselves and others if the others is unknown. And then we asked our participants to interact with others. So that was a very abstract interaction, it was an economic game. And they have to exchange money through computers, so there was nothing physical in the kind of interaction that they had. But of course we have two manipulation. In one condition the others behave cooperatively and fairly with our participants, and in the other condition the other behave unfairly in this money exchange. Everything was of course pre-programmed, it was just fake. And what we show is that, so if you face another person which has been unfair from you, basically your peripersonal space do not change. So it contracts if the other is unknown, and then if the others behave uncooperatively with you, it doesn't change. But then instead, if the other behave cooperatively with you, as you have a positive interaction with the other, what we found is that our participants' peripersonal space expands and incorporate the space around the others. So this concept of peripersonal space, which is very basic and defining the multisensory in terms of multisensory interaction, is sensitive also to social interaction with other people. And finally, the reason why I came to Lausanne working with Olaf is because Olaf wrote this interesting review in Nature Neuroscience where he was explaining the neural basis of the full body illusion. You remember it from Olaf's presentation at the beginning, that the full body illusion is this experimental manipulation able to change the representation of participants in space. I'll remind to people who arrived later to the talk. So if you feel touch on your back and at the same time you see a virtual body, which is actually a video online recording of your own body, but displaced in space. And if the touch you feel on your back is synchronized with the touch you see on the avatar's body, you have the illusion that the avatar's body is your body, and you have the feeling that yourself is shifting towards the location of the avatar. So in order to explain the illusion, Olaf wrote also draw these nice figures where normally, there was not Olaf, was Peter probably who drew it. Normally the peripersonal space around participants is limited to their physical body, but when they perceive this illusion, there must be an extension of the peripersonal space, of the receptive fields of these neurons, so to incorporate the avatar's body. And this was the hypothesis. So when I came here in Lausanne, we say, okay, the first things we have to do this experiment. And the idea is really, let's say this is our participant's body, and this is the normal size of his peripersonal space. When this participant will perceive the illusion, so when touch on their back and touch on the avatar is applied synchronously, the peripersonal space should expand to incorporate the virtual body. And this is compared to a condition in which we give tactile and visual stimulation out of synchrony, and this is our control condition, where nothing happens to your self-representation. Those are the classic questions that normally we use to quantify this illusion. So we ask, for instance, how strong was the feeling that you were drifting forward? And we show that in the synchronous condition, we have this shift of self-location in space. But what happens to your peripersonal space? So this is exactly the task that I explained before. And what it shows here is that, so if this is the physical body of the participants and this is the virtual body, this is the boundary of the peripersonal space of the participants in the asynchronous condition when nothing changes, and this is the boundary of our participants' peripersonal space when they perceive the illusion. As you can see, when they perceive the illusion, the boundary of the peripersonal space shifts towards the avatar's body as to incorporate the avatars. And we went on to this hypothesis because we thought, okay, this kind of extension of peripersonal space can be that the receptive fields of their neurons expands to incorporate the avatar, or there might be something more interesting. So if you ask people where they feel to be during this illusion, they actually perceive themselves at an intermediate position between their physical body and the virtual body. So we thought, if this is the case, this extension of peripersonal space that we see in the front space may actually be not an extension, but a shift of their peripersonal space, from being centered at their physical body to the virtual body. So to test this, we mapped the backspace, and we thought if this is a shift, what we should see is an extension of the front space and a reduction of the backspace. So we tested this hypothesis, we did exactly the same experiment, but now we're testing the backspace. And what we found is that in the asynchronous condition, when there is no illusion, the boundary of peripersonal space is farther, and when they perceive the illusion, so they perceive themselves to be closer to the avatar, which should be here, there is a contraction of the back peripersonal space. So to put everything together, we see an extension in the front, a reduction in the back, which is compatible with the shift of the peripersonal space depending on the illusion. And what I like a lot about this experiment is that the way we quantify this kind of effect is tactile reaction time depending on the position of sound in space. So it's a very basic, very low-level phenomenon. But this captures the experience of the self in space. And we see a shift of this, the center of this multisensory integration from the physical body to the perceived location of the self. So it's like our brain really represents not only our body in space, but also multisensory integration is linked to our body depending on experience. And with this, I'm finishing just by saying that with all of what we are trying really to do is try to propose some models, neuroscientific models based on computational models, based on neuroimaging, on how our brain generates this experience of the self in space, which is linked, we believe, to this peripersonal space mechanism. And the idea is that really peripersonal space started to be conceptualized as a low-level interface, mainly for hand-object interaction. I need to process information because if there is something approaching my hand, I need either to retract my hand or I need to do a movement to grab something. And this is really body part center. But then we believe that there is more than body part center representation. There is a representation on the whole body, which instead is sensitive to where we perceive ourselves in space. We would say it's a hallmark of where we perceive ourselves in space. We would call it the individual peripersonal space, or the alter peripersonal space. And it is that really when you perceive this Santo Spirito being there, what your brain is doing is generating a representation of your body there by integrating multisensory stimuli, starting from the point of resonance of your body and integrating on the information with the environment. But this point of reference center at the body depends on the fact that normally you integrate all stimulation depending on your body. But you can manipulate and you can alter this representation by presenting different multisensory signals as during the body illusions, like the full body illusion. And I would like to thank all the people who collaborated in these projects in the past, you for your attention, and all the fundings.